Hi, fellow Westonka residents. Thank you for allowing us to come into your home. By way of an introduction, I am Buzz Sykes, president of the Westonka Historical Society, Incorporated. We have had historical groups in this area since 1966. However, our present group was formed in 1975 and incorporated into a non-profit organization in 1982. Mr. Gene Hodge was our first elected president. In 1984, we found that none of the communities surrounding Lake Minnetonka had ever memorialized the discovery of the lake. So with the history of the Minnesota Historical, with the help of the State of Minnesota Historical Society, we acquired a plaque which is installed in the Mound Bay Park area. We felt pretty proud of this because it had been overlooked by all communities for 162 years. Mr. Gene Hodge was our first president, has been very active with our group ever since, and has written and put together a program that's going to help us to memorialize the discovery of Minnetonka, plus to mark some of the historic sites, and he is going to film some of these things so that everyone in this area will have a little more knowledge of our past activities. I'd like to present at this time Mr. Gene Hodge.
December 1986. The Westonka Historical Society Incorporated is an organization made up of the whole Westonka area, which includes Mound, Minnetrista, St. Bonnie, Lyndale, Spring Park, and Navarre. This first audio-visual taping is the history of Mound from the early 1900s and even before. A cooperative effort between the Westonka Senior Citizens Incorporated and the Westonka Historical Society Incorporated. The ambition of the Westonka Historical Group is to begin here in Mound and to continue throughout the whole Westonka area, with taping of information from all the other communities involved. This first audiovisual taping will encompass all the area from the Hennepin County Library in Mound, continuing south up 110, originally called Central Avenue, and now known as Commerce Boulevard. We will go past the present location of the old Mound Depot and on up through the Highland area to the end of Highland Boulevard. We will begin our tour today at the Westonka Senior Center and the Community Service Building. The Community Services is located in the Mound Consolidated High School that was dedicated December 16th, 1938. Looking across Commerce Boulevard to Mound's new business area, we see the new Snyder Drug that stands on the land where the Bill Kaler home stood back in the late 1800s. To the left of that, in front of the area between Snyder Drug and the new Mound Medical Clinic, there was a 4-room brick schoolhouse built in 1907. Tonka Toys manufactured their first wooden toys in the red brick schoolhouse. Their offices were in the Bill Kaler home. Turning our camera slightly to the north, we see Bethel United Methodist Church, built on the site where the Little White Church was built in 1892. Anthony P. Kaler was one of the first members of Bethel Church. Looking northwest, we catch a glimpse of the Hennepin County Library, and then we notice the Evangelical Free Church, which was originally St. John's Lutheran. Now we notice the Pond Arena on the site of the old Mound Consolidated High School tennis courts. Looking through the parking lot area, we see the ball fields, the Hadorf Memorial Football Stadium, still being used for Westonka school sports. All of this area so far, including the school buildings and the Hennepin County Library, was the Dewey property back before 1900. Now looking where the recently torn down Anderson building stood, originally there was a Christensen's feed mill, and later a two-story structure with a bakery on the ground level and 2 apartments up above the bakery. Next on that location was Ike O'Neill's beer parlor and restaurant. Then Rondorf Chevrolet Garage, where the Greyhound buses were housed overnight. Next to that was Thompson's Lumber Yard, which later became Streeter Lumber Company. We turn our camera to the south and look where the Super America was until just recently. On this corner was a Standard Oil station, built by Herman Blvd in about 1920, and later owned by Ralph March, and in recent years operated by Clarence Kickifer. Alongside of that station was Al Gooder's one-room barbershop. To the south of that, where Rustique Paint Store is located, was a grocery store owned and operated by Mike and Oscar Johnson in the early 1900s. Where Westonka Sports is now, the Mound Hardware owned by Joe Kraus, and later Pat Nagel and George Euster. Sandwiched in between Westonka Sports and Ben Franklin was the Mound Post Office, run by Postmaster Ed Kaler for many years. Where Ben Franklin is now located, there was an old-fashioned ice cream parlor owned by Ed Kaler. Just across the railroad tracks to the south was a one-room barber shop run by Art Gibo. Now we look to the east to see first Minnesota and the area behind where the Mound Depot stood. To the south of that, we take note of Long Pray's clothing store, located in the old Crocker block. This building was originally occupied by the Johnson brothers, Charlie and Mike Johnson, as a dry goods and a grocery store. Even before the present building where Long Pray's is now, there was a tall hotel building. This was owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. C.J. Smith, the parents of V. Cullen Smith. He still lives here in Mound. At the time of that hotel, Mound had board sidewalks, and the main street of Mound was just a rough mud and gravel road. Just behind Long Pray's, where Dr. Robert Lauer and Dr. Mark Brewer are now, was the home and office of Dr. E.C. Mitchell. Just beyond that is a building where the Mound City Spy was printed, and later the Minnetonka Pilot, which was first printed in 1922. Beyond that is the old American Legion Hall. This was used as a meeting place, dance hall, and a bowling alley. It's still being used today and houses several small businesses. Now looking up above Long Pray's, we see the place where Dr. and Mrs. E.C. Mitchell had their living quarters and office a while before they moved back of Long Pray's. Now we look across to where Koenig and his associates and the Miesel products are located. This was the area where Frank Yost had his drugstore and soda fountain in the early 1900s. The building that Snyder's just vacated was where Gus Brockert's meat market and bakery was. The family living quarters were up above the meat market. Mrs. Oscar May Johnson was the operator of the bakery. Next was a two-story hotel and bar owned by Jack Davis, the father of the late Bill Davis. This was also the ticket office and the boarding place for the Greyhound bus lines. Now we see the Mound Bank, founded in 1909 by E.J. Klodick and Mr. M.H. Hegerly, and purchased by William Kaler in 1913. Where Skip's Outlet, Dick Schwert Insurance, and the tannery are located was the area where Herman Blvd built the livery stable operated in the early 1900s by Bill, Joe, and Andy Krause. Where Contel offices are now was a two-story building also built by Herman Blvd. It was occupied by Gustav Krause and later by Claire Rubel's beauty shop and Dr. Linder's dental office on the main floor. Now looking across Commerce Boulevard again to Fallness Barber Shop, which many years ago was Frank Major's barber shop. The Laker office used to be Mr. and Mrs. George Plant's tailor shop. Next to that was an NSP sales room for stoves and electrical appliances. Now we notice the Mound Body Shop and Beauty Shop and the V&S Jewelers recently vacated. This originally was the Jacob Hole and H.I. Horton garage, and later Finley's Ford garage. Next to this, a building still there, was the Catholic priest's home where Father Yeager lived. Then the Netka apartments on the original site of Our Lady of the Lake Catholic Church. Now looking west again to the present site of Our Lady of the Lake Catholic Church, this area is where Dr. and Mrs. Wilkins lived for many years. It has been said that Dr. Wilkins owned the first car in Mound. It was a sporty red Maxwell. Looking east again, we see the Masonic Lodge, one of the older structures in Mound. Next to that, we see a home where the Morris Bardwells lived, and in more recent years, the home of Mr. and Mrs. Finley. Another home next to that was the Bill Krause home, when they first came to Mound in 1904. Now we notice William's shoe repairs and clothing store and a coin-operated laundry. This was where Allen's Pool Hall was located many years ago. Next on the corner is a two-story house where Grandpa and Grandma Johnson and their 6 children lived. Their 6 children were Helen Walker, Mabel Huff, Edna Gooder, Alice Inman, and 2 sons, Leonard and Elmer. A little further south, we see the second Bill Krause family home. Their family was in the dray business in Mound for many, many years. Looking back west again, where the Catholic Sisters' home and the school now stands, on this very corner was the home of Martin Huff and the Jim Huff families. Just to the left of that, we see the Catholic Annex, formerly Grace Baptist Church, and many years ago it was called the Christian Fundamentalist Church. Now across Commerce Boulevard to the east, we see the home where the Burt Huff family lived in the early 1900s. Next to that, a new structure built where Grandpa and Grandma Solons lived many years ago. Today, this business building is where we find Doctors Peterson and Peterson and several other businesses. Just to the south of that is the old George Hastings home, which housed Mound's first telephone switchboard, operated by Kate Hastings and later on by Carolyn Hastings Sweeney. Next is the Contel Switching and Garage Building. A Mrs. Fitch had a home here many years ago. She was a writer for the Mound City Spy. Now we look to the west again. We see the Westonka Estates behind the Catholic Annex on the shores of Lake Langdon. South of that, we see the Langdon Apartments. A little farther to the south, we see the Langdon Trading Post, just recently built on the shores of Lake Langdon. Now looking across Commerce Boulevard to the east, we see one of the older homes where Mr. and Mrs. C.J. Smith and their son Cullen Smith lived. In fact, Cullen is still living there now. Looking south of the C.J. Smith home, we see houses owned by Ed and Pete Soley, uncles of the Andrews sisters. Next to that is the VFW building, formerly the Jehovah's Witnesses Church. And even before that, the Missouri Synod Lutheran had their meetings there. The Missouri Synod also met in the Methodist and the Baptist Church. Now looking west again, we see the Green Tea Tax Office on the spot where Pete Soley's store was, with an ice house behind, where they harvested ice from Lake Langdon. Next was Elijah Bauer's blacksmith shop in the early 1900s. Across the street was where the Elijah Bauer's family home was. Pointing our camera southwest, we see the Phillips 66 service station on a lot where the oldest home in Mound was. This was the home of Joe and Min Haver Laundry. Now we're viewing the Sunset Hotel, which was later called the Utman Hotel. This is an early 1900s landmark, and it's still here. Up on the hill high above this, where Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Utman lived, and behind that house, along the shore of Lake Langdon, there are units for rental in conjunction with the Sunset Hotel. Across to the east again, another service station on that spot in the home and store of Charles Pearson's was where the incorporation of Mound took place in 1911. The first census in Mound was filed December 4th, 1911. Raising our camera to the hill across Bartlett Boulevard, we see the site where the old Chapman House Hotel was built in 1875 by Seymour and Sumner Chapman. Farther along east, along Bartlett Boulevard, facing on Cook's Bay, was the summer home of Horace Austin, the 6th governor of the state of Minnesota from 1870 to 1874. Now looking towards Cook's Bay, we see the rear of a condominium apartment building. This still stands right where the Chapman Pavilion was. The Chapman Pavilion included a bowling alley, pool tables, and upstairs a dance hall, roller skating floor. There was a boat rental and a bait tank in conjunction with the docking area where the streetcar boats from Excelsior and other parts of the lake would come in. They would unload passengers who would go up the hill to the Chapman House Hotel to stay overnight or longer if they wish. Now looking back south up the hill where the Utmans lived, in later years this was owned by the H.E. Talent family. Beyond that stands a large two-story structure which originally was the home of the first Dr. Mitchell in Mound around 1900. Now we're viewing a beautiful stone structure, the home of Dudley and June Fitz. Originally this property belonged to Horace and Julia Gray. Later it was owned by the Upgards. Mr. Upgard was a furrier. Now looking towards Cook's Bay, we see the Mound Depot in its present location. There's a plaque in front of the Mound Depot erected by Westonka Historical Society Incorporated. This is a plaque telling of the discovery of Lake Minnetonka. The depot stands on the site where Frank Pearson's boathouse stood in the early 1900s. Next to Dudley Fitz's home on the west side of 110, there were two homes owned by the Kraft families. First, there was a two-story structure with their living quarters in the front, facing the road, and right aback of that, attached to the house, toward Lake Langdon, a chicken coop on the lower level and a pigeon loft above. The second Kraft home had a driveway leading down to a barn where the Frank Pearsons stored their rowboats in the wintertime. This was right where we see the new road that goes west from 110. South of the barn was a large apple orchard on that side hill just below where Bernie and Mary Malcheski live now. Bernie told me there was still some apples on one of those trees this year. The Malcheski property was originally owned by Herbert and Nellie Bly around the turn of the century. Turning our camera to the east again, just above the depot, is the present home of Bud Skoglunds. For many years, Olaf Loberg and his family spent the summer months here on Cook's Bay. Looking across 110 to the high bank at the entrance to the Highland Boulevard, we see a part of the Hustis property where many years ago there was a large apple orchard with many varieties of apples. Pointing our camera again toward Cook's Bay, we see a large home originally known as the Bogart property and later the Bert Bly home. To south of that home, recently owned by Bruce and June Robinson, this was previously owned by Ruth G. Grinnell. Just south of that was the site of the Buena Vista Hotel, where the streetcar boats docked and their passengers stayed overnight or longer. This hotel was destroyed by fire after it was nothing but an empty wooden shell of a building in the late 1920s. Now let's get a better look at the Hustis property, now owned by Mr. and Mrs. Larry Bino. Dr. and Mrs. Hustis and son, Dr. Walter Hustis, and their daughter, Frenchie, lived there. We are entering the old Baptist Assembly grounds that hosted many, many Bible conferences year after year. In more recent years, this became the Keswick grounds and Campus Crusade. Billy Graham held his first conference in Minnesota in a tent on that grounds. Stuart Hamblin, whom he brought along from California, was the soloist. Farther along south through the assembly grounds on Highland Boulevard, we come to the home of the Al Uners. This was originally the home of Babcock, and later a Warrington lived there. Traveling along down Highland Boulevard, about the fourth house beyond the Al Uners, we see the Stewart home. They grew beautiful peonies and iris in their gardens that supplied flowers to Bachman's years ago. A little farther down Highland Boulevard, we come to a beautiful stone structure. This is a home that was built by Mr. Smeby, the founder of Dunwoody Institute in Minneapolis. Mrs. Nate Gilman is the present owner of this beautiful home facing on Priest Bay. Almost to the end of Highland Boulevard, we see a little cottage-like house perched on a hill facing Priest Bay. Many years ago, there was an underworld character by the name of Dan Moriarty who sheltered under other underworld characters in that cottage. This house is still being used by some people who come out there to fish and water ski in the summer. This ends our first audio-visual tour. Watch for this tour on Channel 20. Our most sincere thanks to Dowsat for the use of their audio-visual cameras.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man.